Like, make no mistake, I never predict with certainty what the outcome of cases will be. You never know what the dynamics are among the justices. But this was a case that was set up to do immense damage to the crown jewel of American democracy, which is what Democrats and Republicans have called the Voting Rights Act for decades. And that is where this court today signaled it wants to go. Again, understanding it may not get there. It may back away from it. It may, at the last minute, decide not to do this. But everyone needs to be clear-eyed that that is what the court is poised to do. And if it does so, it will have dramatically detrimental effect to Black and Hispanic and other minority voting rights. And it will also potentially tilt the balance of power going into the 2026 midterm elections.
Democrats are tearing each other apart tonight. Total chaos after the Supreme Court just dropped what insiders are calling a democracy nightmare. We're talking about a ruling that could gut the Voting Rights Act, the very law protecting Black and Hispanic voters for decades. The court just signaled it's ready to tilt the balance of power heading into 2026, and Democrats are losing it. Some are blaming Biden. Others say it's the court's revenge play. Either way, it's a political earthquake. Power is shifting, and the fallout could collapse the entire Democratic strategy before the next election.
In 68 years after Martin Luther King pleaded, "Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights," the beating heart of the Voting Rights Act was the subject of debate today in the nation's highest court. And the justices appear to be on the verge of a decision that could have enormous consequences for the upcoming midterms and for our very democracy. At issue today, Louisiana's congressional map adopted last year with 2 majority Black districts in order to comply with curbs on racial gerrymandering put in place by Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The justices today are being asked whether race can be considered a factor in drawing maps. Here's how Janai Nelson, the lawyer defending Louisiana's congressional map, describes the stakes.
Were Section 2 to cease to operate in the way that you just described, what could happen? What would the results on the ground be?
I think the results would be pretty catastrophic. If we take Louisiana as one example, every congressional member who is Black was elected from a VRA opportunity district. We only have the diversity that we see across the South, for example, because of litigation that forced the creation of opportunity districts under the Voting Rights Act. Every justice in Louisiana has been elected through a VRA opportunity district, and nearly all legislative representatives.
The New York Times reports this, quote, without Section 2, Republicans could eliminate upward of a dozen Democratic-held districts across the South. The plaintiffs are seeking to overturn the map and potentially bring down Section 2, argued that creating majority Black districts amounts to discrimination against white voters. Here's what Justice Sonia Sotomayor said about that.
My humble point is that the government has no business telling citizens in which districts they may live or what voting power they may
exercise. But it's not doing that, counsel. The 6 plaintiffs in this case are white plaintiffs who live in a district with Black voters. So no one's keeping them out of that district. No one's stopping them from participating in the voting process. No one is stopping them from trying to run candidates or support candidates that reflect their views.
An attorney for the Trump administration called the voting map a, quote, reverse partisan gerrymander, saying that white Democrats in red states do not get maps drawn, allowing them to elect Democratic candidates. But the logic of that ignores the history. It ignores why the Voting Rights Act exists, why it was put in place in the first place. And it ignores the impact that any decision weakening or striking down parts of the Voting Rights Act will have. Once again, here's Janai Nelson.
My opponents here would like to make this a partisan issue because they believe the case law will enable their case to prevail, but it does not. This is about race. Section 2 and the Voting Rights Act is laser focused on eliminating racial discrimination from our electoral process, regardless of party. And if we look at many of the Black Congress people who were elected, they came out of Section 2 opportunity districts. They don't have to be majority-minority districts. Many of them are crossover districts. And so if we remove Section 2, we also recognize that there will likely be a resurgence of discrimination because Section 2 plays a deterrent effect.
That is where we begin today with some of our favorite experts and friends. MSNBC senior contributing editor Michelle Norris is here. Also joining us, voting rights attorney, founder of Democracy Docket, Mark Elias. Mark Elias, I ask you the same question that we started with here, the stakes of today's arguments in case.
So here we go again. Another week, another crisis for democracy, manufactured by the same media that's been crying wolf since 2016. They're acting like the Supreme Court daring to review the Voting Rights Act is some kind of apocalyptic event. In truth, it's about fixing a law that's been twisted beyond recognition by political elites who use race as a shield to preserve their power. They talk about representation, but it's always selective. If a district leans Democrat, it's fair. If it leans Republican, suddenly it's suppression. It's the same double standard that's poisoned every institution in this country. The elites wrap themselves in moral language while redrawing lines to keep their own voters in control. I think most Americans are tired of being told they're the problem just because they want equal rules for everyone. What's happening isn't about race, it's about control. And once again, the people who scream the loudest about fairness are the ones terrified of losing their grip. The court isn't destroying democracy. It's reminding Washington that it doesn't own it.
Yeah, the stakes are enormous. I mean, the fact is that the Supreme Court of the United States heard a case today that, to be clear, no one brought to them. The case that was brought to them out of Louisiana was argued last term, did not challenge the underlying constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. We went through briefing, we went through oral argument, we all waited for a decision by the end of last June in the case that was actually brought by the plaintiffs and the petitioners in that case. Instead, what happened is the Supreme Court decided that it wanted to hear a different case. So it ordered the parties to brief and re-argue a broader question, the question of whether or not Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act remains constitutional, and if so, how does it get severely limited? And that was what the argument was about today. Like, make no mistake, I never predict with certainty what the outcome of cases will be. You never know what the dynamics are among the justices, but this was a case that was set up to do immense damage to the crown jewel of American democracy, which is what Democrats and Republicans have called the Voting Rights Act for decades. And that is where this court today signaled it wants to go. Again, understanding it may not get there. It may back away from it. It may, at the last minute, decide not to do this. But everyone needs to be clear-eyed that that is what the court is poised to do. And if it does so, it will have dramatically detrimental effect to Black and Hispanic and other minority voting rights. And it will also potentially tilt the balance of power going into the 2026 midterm elections.
Mark Elias, just refresh my memory on the history of the lack of partisanship. Is George W. Bush the last Republican president to renew the Voting Rights Act? I believe I remember an event in the Roosevelt Room where that is renewed, and then it becomes a political piñata in the last 2 decades. Is that, I mean, just take me through the political side, not the legal side of this debate.
Sure. So the Voting Rights Act gets enacted in 1965 with bipartisan support. Republicans and Democrats both voted to enact the Voting Rights Act. It was renewed under Republican presidents. It was renewed by Ronald Reagan in 1982. And in fact, not only was it renewed under Ronald Reagan in 1982 with, again, overwhelming bipartisan support, it was actually expanded. The provision that is now being attacked, this Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits both discrimination in voting with intent, but also with the effects of discriminating against voters, that was put into law in 1982 under Ronald Reagan. Again, wide bipartisan support. It was, as you point out, reauthorized again in 2006 under George W. Bush, passed the Senate 98-0. There were only 33 no votes against it in the House. It was sponsored by the business community. Walmart's president and CEO pushed for reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. And it is only in the age of Donald Trump and in his first term and now, today, in which it has become a party line issue, in which no Republican will support reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act.
Michelle, I thought that I think it's important context that legally and politically, right now it's another thing pulling our country apart. Through its existence, it has been one of the few things that brought us together, that Democrats and Republicans agreed on, that had unanimous votes in the Senate, and 22 was, even in those times, a very small number of dissenters in the House. And here we are now. With that larger frame, tell me how you watch today's arguments.
The panic you hear on cable news right now isn't about justice, it's about power slipping away. You've got lawyers, pundits, and activists trying to convince America that if Section 2 gets questioned, it's the end of voting rights as we know it. But let's be honest, they're not protecting voters. They're protecting a system that keeps one party permanently safe. When I listen to these experts, it's clear they see the court as a political weapon. They act shocked that justices dare to ask real questions. That's not corruption. That's the system finally holding the bureaucracy accountable. Yet the media spins it like a coup. They never mention how Democrats gerrymander blue states to lock in power, or how the same elites cry democracy while censoring speech they don't like. To me, this moment feels like the establishment realizing the referee isn't always on their side anymore. They built their empire on moral theater, pretending to be the guardians